It's a rare occurrence that I feel nostalgic about games of my youth, where video games seem to cater for the player rather than the corporate wallet. That feeling is revived, albeit for a short time, thanks to Game Dev SG's recently released first title on Steam called Gobbo's Gambit. I also want to mention that Team Game Dev SG has a thriving Discord community and website dedicated to helping game developers of all levels advance their skill sets and knowledge. To quote its founder Sterling Reams, that at Game Dev SG, our mission is to help you find your path. And I've added their socials, including YouTube, Discord, and the website in the description below. So the story goes that you play as an NPC called Gobbo that has suddenly become sentient, deciding he no longer wants to perform his duties as a minion guard with the goal of escaping the dangerous dungeon he once patrolled. Now, it should be said that this game is far from completion as it's still in active development, so my session only lasted about 20 minutes, but expect major updates in the future and be mindful of its development if you decide to experience the game for yourself, as it's free to download on Steam. The main menu is well presented and includes a moving background and ambient sounds of fire torches flickering away, and a brilliant choice of music that drew me in right away. The only issue being that the options button wasn't available yet, so if you're looking to change visuals, sound or controls, you're out of luck for the moment. Starting the game and entering the first loading screen, you are treated with some of the concept art created for the game, which is an interesting behind the scenes look at the game's development. Starting the game and entering the first loading screen, you are treated with some of the concept art created for the game, which is an interesting behind-the-scenes look at the game's development. However, landscape concept art that shows off the level design or in-game screenshots allow for stronger engagement and a better first impression in my opinion. As we finally take control of Gobbo, I noticed that there was no tutorial or informative text, at least yet, to help me understand my controls, which should be one of the first things the player is informed about. Regardless, after some experimenting, I was able to understand the fundamentals. I would have liked to have seen a short cinematic or heard some dialogue that explains how Gobbo became sentient. Unless you read the Steam description on the game page, you aren't likely to know any of the story, and I'd say that's probably a lot of people. In terms of visuals and performance, I was usually well above 60 frames per second, which was a comfort that some measure of testing was done before release. Although some areas were prone to frame stutters and frame rate drops that would impact immersion, which I'm sure will be addressed as the development continues. The art style is an excellent choice for this type of game, which I would label a 3D platformer. Its theming is relatively consistent throughout, except for the later areas where they haven't had quite the same level of attention yet. The character model of Gobbo himself is quirky, fun, and appropriate for the game's design. He looks like he actually belongs in that world. Although, the only note here is his choice of clothing. Being previously a guard, it seems strange he's dressed the way he is. This only becomes stranger when we see what the enemy looks like. At about the 8 minutes in mark, we are introduced to the player enemy, which takes the form of large-headed skeletons armed with various weapons. The issue here is that Gobbo was a guard just like them as far as we know, which leaves me confused as to why Gobbo is such a departure from the rest of his previous guard comrades. It also gets a little confusing where certain mechanics are concerned. An example is when Gobbo must move objects onto weight-sensitive triggers like the red buttons you will see repeatedly throughout the game. It's not obvious you can even move any objects, and even when you do figure this out, you awkwardly bash Gobbo's character model against objects to move them, as there is no actual push or pull animation that would make these interactions a little smoother. Again, I want to mention a short tutorial or instructional text either at the start or in the mechanic relevant area that would help players understand the mechanics quicker and easier. The sound effects like the flickering fire torch sounds are a promising aspect of things to come in terms of delivering a sense of closeness, which emphasizes the attractiveness of using stealth as opposed to brute force, which I might add works well with the music playing throughout the levels. It would be great to have Gobbo express himself vocally, even little noises as he traverses throughout the game as he runs, jumps, hides, etc. Which brings me to voice acting. I can't overstate how important some level of narration is. Having an inner dialogue I think would be a good choice here, as it helps the player connect with the character by allowing the player to understand his motive, his story, as well as generally his thoughts and feelings throughout the game, which can create greater depths of immersion. The game world could benefit from some more ambient sounds like water drops from the ceiling, stones crumbling or falling, dust and wind flying about as doors open or close, even enemy chatter as you sneak about, as the playstyle is intended to focus on more stealth approaches. Sound effects like these will make sneaking around more engaging. After some time, I found the aiming icon to be ill-suited to the aesthetic the game had, and I'm not sure having this aim icon visible while not wielding the crossbow is necessary, or at least it should change to a simpler design to indicate the change of circumstance. When it comes to combat, using the crossbow, reloading and aiming all feel pretty good, but being the hair splitter I am, I would suggest having Gobbo automatically reload at the point there are no more bolts left to shoot, instead of making it a manual reload effort. And although a minor critique, I would love to see a recoil animation for Gobbo as he shoots his crossbow, to make it seem like the weapon he uses has some weight and force in using it. Picking up the crossbow after finally noticing the help text on screen, I did find it odd that you had to be looking directly at the object for this information to appear. Changing this to a nearby area trigger instead might be beneficial for keeping a certain pace in the game, as well as help some players who would otherwise get confused as to what they're supposed to be doing at this point. This sort of change could be applied to other areas that use help text also, like the starting area and moving the barrel onto the red button. Moving on to the crossbow triggers found throughout the game, they are all the same red and white target boards. Making these more relevant items like gate or door keys would help develop the game's sense of identity further, as the targets decrease my immersion of Gobbo's world. When it comes to finding your way around the dungeon, it's pretty simple, but using glow bugs to highlight the areas of interest is a fantastic way of keeping the player moving forward, without spending too much time wandering around trying to work out what they're supposed to be doing and where they're supposed to be going. At a certain point, I did start to notice some areas that needed a little more attention, like the support beam sticking out of a box and untextured walls in the shooting range. Speaking of the shooting range, I was confused about how to interact with the red button until I realized I had to be looking directly at it for the help text to appear. Again, this would be better if there was an area trigger rather than a direct look trigger, because up until this point, red buttons had been a wait trigger, not a key push trigger, which I found to be an odd change this early on. One last note on the shooting range is that there is no hit register like you saw in the target dummies where you first picked up the crossbow. So you are not sure if you're doing it right until the timer ends and big white text states winner and the door opens. Why the target practice session opened the door, I'm not sure. To me, this didn't make much sense. After the shooting range area, the targets start to use glowing crystals to inform the player you have hit your mark, which was a much needed visual indicator. This also raised suspicions that there might be more targets around to unlock something, which is a simple but clever gameplay choice to include. The only way this could be improved is to add a sound effect when you hit the target and the crystal changes colour. Speaking of crystals, the dungeon we find ourselves in trying to escape from seems to be more like a mining operation, to which I can only assume this until there are some story-related aspects implemented in the game to build players' understanding of where we really are and what we are doing there. Entering our first enemy encounter, the music suddenly changes, but the music triggers don't seem to be tested well enough, as your proximity and view of enemies start and stops music rather awkwardly. Some more work is needed with enemy AI as well, as they often didn't notice me standing right next to them. Another example is when they pursue me after I shot them. They would tend to give up a few seconds later, and nearby enemies didn't seem to care or engage in the fight happening right near them. Probably the most bizarre part of the combat is the fact that more often than not, when I defeated an enemy, their remains lie scrambled on the ground, the combat music still played, and I could hear weapon swings, which only stopped after I shot their corpse. To which I only noticed this as their awareness icons in the form of a white eye above their heads were still present as they lay dead, only to disappear after the final shot. Sometimes even 2 shots were needed. Moving on, I just wanted to quickly touch on the player camera, how it hovers over Gobbo's right shoulder by default. There was no way I could switch shoulders or center the camera, which I would hope to find in the settings menu once that's complete and implemented. There is some great asset design in this game too, but I do want to point out the elevator design as a departure of this game design. This is probably still being worked on, but in case it isn't, Spending more time improving the design of elevators would better complement the game world and help players understand its purpose more quickly, as without the system of pulleys and cables around it, you don't necessarily understand its purpose right away. There are also no sound effects associated with the elevator, which again forms part of where Gobbo's Gambit can improve the most for player immersion, by fleshing out the game world with more sound effects, which I'm sure is already on a list of development tasks. I must say my favourite part of this game is the crystal switch puzzle minigame. It's not complicated by any means, but it's a great sign of some fun game mechanics to come. Again, this area suffers from lack of sound effects that can make this section of the game shine a little more. Returning back to the elevators, just one point about the cinematic. The cinematic of the elevator would have been good to see the first time you used an elevator, so it can establish some sort of consistency when moving between levels. Also, a minor tweak here to temporarily hide the aim sight would improve this short cinematic. Earlier I mentioned that stealth wasn't given much of a focus, which I hope we will see greater emphasis on, as I note that the official Steam page mentions the game includes strategic stealth gameplay, a playstyle that so far isn't quite established as I would have hoped for. So the level design is a great opportunity to focus more on sneaking and hiding, rather than run and gun, which I believe would make those smaller areas more interesting to navigate through, as a sense of tension builds up, especially if the enemies are to become more dangerous. The crossbow doesn't seem to make sense after playing through the game, and I think this game could have a better focus on stealth mechanics if the crossbow was removed altogether, at least until we have escaped the first dungeon. Entering the last level, you have the option of using movable blocks to climb up to the next area, but you can more easily just walk up the stairs. While it was initially confusing, I'm giving the benefit of the doubt that this area design hasn't been fully realised yet, and some ideas the developers were playing around with made it into the first release. This idea is further evidenced as I noticed some of the assets were unfinished compared to the more detailed assets throughout the game up until this point. What Game Dev SG has managed to create is a very promising first release that follows an aesthetically pleasing set of visuals and level design, with decent optimization and simple yet effective mechanics, with an overall polish that tells me this team has a great sense of pride in their creation. Gobbo's Gambit, in summary, could benefit from a focus on story development components like internal dialogue narration, introducing environment sound effects, as well as sound effects for Gobbo himself, more development in the stealth playstyle, and adding a simple HUD tutorial at the beginning for controls, and again at areas where new mechanics are introduced. Regardless of these areas for improvement that are likely already in the pipeline, you have the makings of an excellent quality game, and I'm excited to see what the future holds for this game going forward. To potential new players, I would encourage you to go into Gobbo's Gambit with the knowledge that it is still in active development. So for those of you who want to experience Gobbo's Gambit for yourself, I encourage you to download it now for free on Steam. Again, I've listed the development team's social links in the description below. Thanks for watching.